If you were a 90s kid, or an early 2000s kid, or if you've ever been a kid sometime after 1994, you've probably heard of LeapFrog. Since being founded in 1994, LeapFrog has produced tons of educational kids' toys, which, sure, lots of companies make toys, but what sets this one apart from the rest is how innovative it was early on, and how iconic some of its products were because of this. The first product launched by LeapFrog was the Phonics Desk in 1995, which wasn't the most iconic of toys, but it was a start. After Michael Wood, LeapFrog's founder, had trouble teaching his son to read, he created the Phonics Desk to be not just a fun toy, but a learning tool rooted in children's reading development. It was a board full of letters that made phonetic sounds as they were pressed as individual buttons, or moved around and connected to spell a word on special cards.
Dog. Awesome!
Combining tactile pieces with audio clips as kids played made for a reading lesson that wasn't just educational but fun and interactive, a direction that LeapFrog continued to move forward with as it expanded. Over the next few years, LeapFrog introduced a few other toys that followed a similar design to the Phonics Desk, utilizing an interactive alphabet on other fun keyboard designs, like a bus, caterpillar, or a horribly unphotogenic stuffed frog, which also came in an equally terrifying baby version. No matter what they looked like, these toys continued to focus on teaching the phonetic sounds of each letter to encourage discovering sounds and new words altogether. But while these toys were great for learning to spell and sounding out words, they were still limited in how far the lessons could go, because even in different shapes, they were, at their core, just a keyboard with sounds. One of the best ways to encourage spelling and phonics is through not just individual letters and words, but through a bunch of words put together, like in a story. And in 1999, the culmination of LeapFrog's progress was launched: the LeapPad learning system. The LeapPad expanded on the original LeapFrog product ideas of phonics and building words, but now with a ton of upgrades, including stories. Instead of being just another fun-shaped keyboard, the LeapPad functioned more like a book, or I guess kind of like a book holder. Book explorer? Let me just show you an example. Each LeapFrog branded activity book came with a cartridge that, after being slotted into the LeapPad binder, turned a regular book into an interactive experience. When you pressed go, it would play this sound, and some fun background music, and the lines of the story on each page would be read aloud through the speaker, bringing the story to life.
Here we are at the store. Mom says we'll buy socks and more.
And you could also touch each word with the stylus to read or spell them individually.
Leap, Dave, pat, tap, rap.
As you can imagine, having a complete story was already a huge step up from toys like the Phonics Desk that were limited to single words. But, like the name implies, the LeapPad learning system wasn't just a story reader, but a system of features. The stylus wasn't just for reading words. If you tapped around on the page even outside of the words, it offered different surprises or even more ways to play. Touching the characters, like the little froggy family, made significantly less terrifying in cartoon form, would play different voice lines that went along with the story.
Yep, it's loose all right.
Touching details in the background would play little sound effects based on the picture, and most pages included a mini-game to play related to the story or illustrations, like finding hidden details in the pictures. Because there was so much to tap around on, it never really felt like learning. I had my own LeapPad as a kid, the girly pop pink and purple version, of course, and one book that really stands out in my memory is The Great Dune Buggy Race. It was so long ago that I can't actually remember all that much of the story itself, but I do remember all the pictures and sound effects and mini-games and extra details that made it feel like a really immersive 4D IMAX Ultra Dune Buggy experience. And yet, when I look at videos of the same book, it's only like 20 pages long, and it was really not that exciting.
Here I go. This is fun. Where am I? Awesome. I made it. Yay!
which I think just speaks to how well this delivered content to kids, even without the use of screens or anything that actually moves. Even when you got bored of reading, you could still ignore the story altogether and make your own fun by exploring the pages, tapping around on different things to see what they would do.
Your Mac friend, Brent Rambo.
So even when I would just sit there spamming the same sound effect over and over,
I made a boo-boo, yeah.
I was still technically learning. Or at least had the potential to learn, which definitely counts for something. Making education both self-guided and fun is one of the best ways to encourage kids to keep learning at their own pace and in a way that interests them, and I think that's also one of the best parts about the LeapPad, striking a balance between education and imagination. Clearly, the LeapPad had a lot of capabilities beyond just being a reading aid, and it capitalized on this potential through the variety in its cartridges. There were books made for different grade levels and school subjects, with the LeapFrog branded stories featuring the main Froggy family characters in a world full of animals. I don't know what it was about the 90s and early 2000s, but frogs were kind of weirdly popular to use as early education mascots. If you were sick of seeing so many frogs or just didn't vibe with them, maybe from, I don't know, unresolved baby alphabet frog trauma in your formative years, there were also tons of other LeapPad books based on licensed media instead. Movies, book series, Marvel characters, Disney franchises. You know how kids' products go. Take any popular character, print it on a insert thing here, and it'll probably sell. But the licensed media LeapPad books, in my experience, weren't just print-and-go cash grabs. The books were totally themed around each franchise, faithfully tying in the characters and their stories so that it was well-rounded and engaging, not just as educational material, but as a tie-in for the original media. I had a book based on The Incredibles, and I remember it being really fun. It wasn't just a copy-paste of the movie's story, but had all the LeapPad extras like minigames and sound effects, and I wasn't even that big of a fan of the movie. I mean, I like it and everything, just nothing crazy. But I'd still reread this particular LeapPad book over and over just to be able to keep playing. I might just be biased because I had one of these myself when I was younger, but even aside from the learning value, just the technology of this thing is still so impressive to me. It's like a combination of a book, a board game, and a music player all in one, complete with the stylus that's reminiscent of touchscreens, even though it wasn't a touchscreen at all. It really utilized the technology that was available at the time to create an experience that's not unlike modern tablets today. I guess the LeapPad is kind of like an early tablet ancestor, if you will. And yet, even with the high-techness of modern touchscreens, I kind of find the LeapPad more impressive, in a way. Maybe just because I still have no idea how it works. How is paper making sound? How does it know that I turned a page? Does the LeapPad learning system know where I live? I guess I also don't technically know how touchscreens work either, but I can at least connect the dots between screens and computer chips a little more easily than I can with paper books and plastic pens somehow making music. If you're curious, like I am, I looked up the patent to solve this 26-year-old mystery, and apparently, by my unscientific paraphrasing, there's a big plate that's inside the LeapPad base with electrodes in each corner. The plate has an electrographic sensor that measures how much current is flowing relative to each corner's electrode, which is then used to triangulate where the stylus is touching on the plate, kind of like coordinates on a graph. And after pressing the go button, each with its own unique location, the LeapPad is also able to tell when you've turned to a new page. I don't know if anyone else finds this interesting, but as a kid, and honestly up until 5 minutes ago when I read this information myself, I kind of thought it was magic, so this has been very eye-opening. This same technology was first used in the Odyssey Globe made by Explore Technologies, which LeapFrog acquired in 1998, and which led to the creation of the legendary LeapPad. Again, given my bias from having so much fun with this as a kid, I wondered if this topic might actually be a little more niche than it seemed according to my memory, but it turns out that the LeapPad was not only a success in the Dream Jelly household. In the years following its launch, the LeapPad was the top-selling toy in the US in both 2001 and 2002, and once everyone had one, its books and accessories were the top sellers of 2003. With a success of this scale and so early on into the company's lifespan, it was clear that the LeapPad would be a tough act to follow. LeapFrog continued to create educational toys that were a mix of innovative technology and hands-on interactive play, like the Twist and Shout that was sort of like a math-themed Bop It, and the Imagination Desk, which functioned similarly to the LeapPad and encouraged writing, but wasn't as expansive. There were a handful of other LeapFrog toys produced in the early 2000s, but nothing that hit quite like the LeapPad, until 2002, with the launch of the Leapster. The Leapster was a handheld console that ditched the screenless magic of the activity books for, well, a screen. Each Leapster cartridge was themed around a different subject or franchise, similar to the LeapPad books, and still included stories, but there were now also animations and fully playable activities and minigames, on not just a screen, but a kind of primitive touchscreen. If the LeapPad was like if books were playable and fun, the Leapster was like if video games were playable and fun, which they already are, so they're like if video games were also educational. In addition to the versatility of the screen, the Leapster was a lot smaller, which made it more portable, and its familiar controller-esque design made it more accessible for kids to pick up and understand right away. In the current age of iPad kids, I know that looking at this thing now, it might not seem all that interesting or impressive. It's not like this was the first ever handheld game console, and it wasn't the first educational video game, but it was still innovative for other reasons. Touchscreens, while not completely new, weren't widespread by this point. The Nintendo DS wouldn't come out for another couple of years, which made the Palm Pilot really the closest mainstream equivalent, if anyone remembers those. But that thing was made for boring admin adult stuff, and the only games on it were chess and solitaire. Ugh. Even though I was a weird kid and liked playing Palm Pilot Solitaire and filling in address books and calendars with fake appointments, I of course saw much more appeal in the Leapster, which was actually geared towards kids. Even though I had a LeapPad, I remember being so jealous when my friend got a Leapster because it was arguably just cooler at the time, even though now as an adult I'm still more impressed by the magic musical paper. It was all high-tech and fancy and moving. I did eventually get my own Game Boy later on though, so I got over it. But before I got hooked on the Sims Bustin Out, I naturally gravitated towards the Leapster for its novelty. And aside from its general appeal to kids, the educational benefits were of course also a major selling point to parents. It wasn't just a Game Boy clone or competitor, but it was made specifically for learning that, again, didn't necessarily feel like learning. Most other edutainment games required not just a computer, but an understanding of each new game and its controls. Leapster cartridges, though, could all be played on the same console with a familiar set of controls, features, and teaching styles, and could be taken anywhere, making it revolutionary for the early 2000s. Although it did still utilize a lot of the same playstyles and features of the LeapPad, the Leapster wasn't necessarily a replacement that made the LeapPad obsolete, but a modern successor that targeted the growing popularity of video games and technology in general. There was even the L-Max Leapster that could connect to the TV. Nintendo Switch who? Meanwhile, into 2003, the LeapPad system was still expanding, with a new and improved version called the Quantum Pad, a LeapPad that supported writing, and the never-ending Mind Station that connected to the computer to download new LeapPad content onto rewritable cartridges through the power of the internet. So futuristic. There was also the Leapster adjacent iQuest that was aimed towards slightly older kids as a study aid, using cartridges based on specific textbooks to generate quiz questions. On the opposite end of LeapFrog's demographic, there were also plenty more early education toys being produced alongside the Leapster and LeapPad. Most of them were still based in the original focus of phonics and learning with letters, though others ventured into music, math, and real-world learning like groceries and counting money. There were even LeapFrog straight-to-DVD animated series that were first released in 2003, where the original early frog-themed mascot and scary little baby alphabet frog evolved into the Froggy family that was featured in the LeapPad books. The main frog Leap, his little siblings Lily and Tad, and Mom and Dad Frog were all adapted into cartoons. There's not a whole lot of lore or anything to be found here, as they're mostly just little learning adventures in the animal-filled world that they live in, but it's still an interesting idea to expand the basic book characters into a more involved format. So, all that to say, LeapFrog was clearly in its golden era. With the evergreen content of the interchangeable books and games, for the next few years, there wasn't much change in the company's products, until around 2008, when the original LeapPad was phased out and discontinued. This wasn't the end of the LeapPad entirely, though, but more of a reimagining of the format. The all-new tag reading system still functioned with a pen and special LeapFrog books, but now the pen was the LeapPad. Everything electronic was contained within the tag stylus. The media was loaded through a USB connection to the computer instead of a cartridge, and the new books could be read without needing to lie perfectly flat, which all eliminated the need for the original LeapPad altogether. Although the new system looked different, all the same features were still there, from the narration and character voices to music and sound effects, to playing games and tapping on the pictures on the pages to repeat the same sound over and over. It was also a lot less bulky, without needing to keep track of the LeapPad binder, the books, and the matching cartridges, and you no longer had to worry about kids chewing on the wire of the LeapPad stylus, which I definitely didn't do. It was the end of an era for LeapPad, but still the same exact concept, which I think was definitely a smart move. Even though the Leapster was a clear sign that kids' toys were trending towards a more tech-based standard, the tag books were still just normal, traditional books. This physical media was a refreshing step away from how everything began to develop a screen, even in 2008, and kept the magic of the original format alive. Including to me. Because how is the paper making noise again? What is this witchcraft? I do not understand. It's not magic though. The technology is actually even more simple this time around. The special LeapPad books are printed with a series of small dots over each page that act as a code for the tag stylus to read. Depending on the letter, shape, or picture, the tag pen reads the dots surrounding it and plays the matching sound. I'm sure this is probably just my bias showing again, but I remember that when the tag system first launched, even as a 9-year-old, I thought it just seemed kind of lame. Seeing the whole LeapPad being reduced to just a measly little pen seemed less fun than loading up the old bulky binder and sticking in the cartridge, even if the actual playstyle was more or less unchanged. And to be fair, there aren't really any benefits to the LeapPad either. It is cumbersome and old and prone to getting misaligned, but kind of felt like a spy gadget in a way, instead of just a talking pen. But I think that was just me, and maybe one of my first instances of feeling nostalgia before I'd even hit double digits, which probably explains my YouTube channel now. 2008 also saw the release of the Leapster 2, an upgraded version with USB connectivity, along with the Crammer and the Didge. The Crammer was another attempt to appeal to older school-age kids, being promoted as not just a study aid like the iQuest, but an MP3 player too. In case you'd always wished your iPod could feed you flashcards and music at the same time. MP3 players were very popular at the time and came in all kinds of weird shapes and styles, so this wasn't a terrible concept, but I do think that LeapFrog overestimated the overlap between teenagers who liked MP3 players and teenagers that would genuinely want or use a digital flashcard machine. And then there was the Didge, which was kind of like a Leapster, but a bit weirder. Where the Leapster was advertised as an educational toy, the Didge was marketed as more of a cool, modern video game console, but one that also only plays educational games. It featured USB connectivity where you could make your own custom avatar called a Digi on the computer and then play with it in the games, which is kinda cool. I'm guessing this was LeapFrog's response to Nintendo's Mii's. It was also promoted as having next-gen graphics, which is certainly a choice phrase to use, considering that it looks like that. This is what the PSP's graphics looked like for comparison, which had launched 4 years before the Dig. It admittedly still doesn't look terrible, but the actual gameplay of the games was also basic and kinda janky, which is fine for an edutainment system like the Leapster, but maybe not so great for trying to appeal to actual gamers. There was even an ad that tried to market the Dig to teenagers, like college-aged teenagers.
Your child's outgrown the Leapster and you're thinking he's done, ready for college. But you'd be wrong, because he's now ready to graduate to the new LeapFrog Dig. Faster-paced games, customized learning. After that, college.
I say tried, though, because I don't know what middle schooler, let alone teenager or college student, would earnestly pick up a Dig to play video games instead of literally almost any other console ever. The Dig did have some licensed media games that were common with LeapFrog systems, but its only real defining feature was the little bobblehead digis you could make. It was just a step too far outside of LeapFrog's existing brand to gain any real traction with education-oriented audiences, and likely way too lame to land with actual gamers. It was actually hard to find much info on this thing at all, which I'm assuming is indicative of its success, or lack thereof. If you or a loved one were one of the likely very few Dig players out there, I'd love to hear about your experience. Between the tag reader, the Leapster, iQuest, and I guess the Dig, there wasn't really an immediate need for any brand new products, so over the next few years, LeapFrog focused on creating new content for and improving their existing systems. In 2010, the Leapster Explorer released as the next version of the Leapster, and in 2011, the LeapPad Explorer launched as LeapFrog's first real tablet, which coincided with the launch of the original Apple iPad, with full touchscreen controls and a camera, microphone, and downloadable apps, fully moving the company into the digital age. Further into the 2010s, LeapFrog did continue to make a few other smaller-scale kids' toys on the side, and another successor to the tag reader that now supported writing, but from this point on, it was kind of just all about tablets and tablet-like toys, like the LeapPad 2, Leapster GS, LeapPad Ultra, LeapPad 3, LeapPad Platinum, LeapFrog Epic, and even the LeapBand, a wearable sort of Apple Watch Tamagotchi Leapster hybrid that tracked activity. And yes, the word leap is beginning to lose all meaning to me too. With most of its product catalog being reduced to a tablet catalog, LeapFrog wasn't totally failing as a company, but it was failing to stand out from the crowd like it had in its golden era, which is especially important for a kids' toy producer. Despite starting off on such a strong foot with the original LeapPad and Leapster, the company was no longer the leader in educational toys anymore. It wasn't that its products were unsuccessful, but tablets were becoming increasingly common and less impressive, and almost every other kid's toy had some built-in technology aspect. There was little room to innovate anymore, which wasn't really the fault of the company, but just how the digital age had progressed. LeapFrog did venture into creating iOS apps, including a couple that had their own tie-in toys, while the cartoon series was still being produced and had undergone a few changes over the years, so that it was now CGI animated, which made them look kind of uncanny, but as long as it's hip with the kids. But LeapFrog needed to take even bigger steps, or hops, to make something creative and memorable that would stand out from all the rest of the tech out there. Something that had never been done before. Something like LeapTV. As a venture back into video game consoles once more, LeapTV was yet another educational toy, but instead of a handheld system like the Dig, it connected to the TV and even featured motion controls. Which is a neat idea. Maybe it could have even taken off, if not for all of the companies that had already done it first. The VTech V-Smile, a kids' educational console, released in 2004, followed by the Wii with motion controls in 2006, the V-Smile V-Motion with motion controls in 2008, and the Xbox Kinect with camera-based motion controls in 2010. And when did the LeapTV come out, you may be asking? in 2014 after a delayed release. To give it a little credit, it's not like something has to be completely new and never heard of before for it to be successful, but considering all of its predecessors and the existing mainstream consoles that could play both kid-oriented and more mature games, it was just a little too niche and a little too late. Unsold inventory of LeapTV and other toys led to a 40% drop in revenue and even a lawsuit in 2015 against the company for declining sales and failure to disclose that they were not making much money. Nevertheless, LeapFrog persisted. In 2016, after plenty of trial and error, video game ventures, and tablet production, LeapFrog went back to basics. The LeapStart was essentially a new and improved version of the original LeapPad, complete with the bulky binder and chewable pen cord, only it was now geared especially towards younger ages. There were also no game cartridges as content could be downloaded via USB, but still, it was back. I was onto something back in 2008 when they first got rid of that glorious bulky ass case. The children yearn for the LeapPad. VTech, the maker of the V-Smile that totally wasn't a direct inspiration for the late great LeapTV, actually acquired LeapFrog also in 2016, and I'm pleased to report that now, almost 10 years later, LeapFrog is still going strong. The LeapStart is also still in production, and there's even Bluey books, which is a good sign that it's still relevant with the modern youth. There's also a newer version of the Tag reading pen, which is no LeapPad, but I'm glad that that's still around too. Even though there is a ton of potential in electronic and tablet-based learning, I'd say in 2025 we've definitely looped back around to where more physical media like this is a novelty again, and has its own benefits for reducing screen time. The LeapStart 3D, which is a version that includes a little screen with the system, is a good example of striking a balance between iPad babies and fully analog media. LeapFrog also still produces plenty of other early education toys, and not just a variety of tablets that all have Leap in the name, but other toys that embrace and encourage modernity without fully relying on screens, along with phonics toys that stick to the company's roots. In 2022, LeapFrog did release another game console, the Leapland Adventures Plug and Play, which made me a little nervous when I first read up on it considering their video game track record, but this time it was a nominee for a Toy of the Year award, which is much better than a lawsuit, and a great sign for the company's continued success. All in all, even through all of its technological advances and experimental products, LeapFrog is stable, and that makes my nostalgic heart happy. I'm glad that kids will still be able to discover the magic of wondering how paper makes sounds, even in 2025, and that LeapFrog's legacy will continue to live on. Hi, welcome to JellyTV, where I shout out a video that I think deserves some love. I recommend watching The Weird Music Tech We Thought Was the Future, Hit Clips, iDogs, and More by Secondhand Nostalgia. If you thought LeapFrog's grammar was weird, Zoe delves into even more weird and kind of unnecessary music playing toys from the 90s and early 2000s. Even though most of these are obsolete now, the novelty is still so real, and I never realized how many music-specific toys there were until they were all compiled like this. Zoe clearly knows their stuff, so I recommend checking out this video and the rest of their channel. A huge thank you to Daniel E. from ABQ, Kevin Evans, Baby Angel, Bunzo, Karis Desarun, Chumby, Hayden Campbell, Lojwa Animal, Lou, Luna Stephenson, Mark Kent, Nighttime Coral, Ollie E, Online Grandpa 1, Paper Sam, Pharmamags, Pixel Puppy, Shaples, Theodore Nicolowilius, and the rest of my patrons for supporting me.